as a Native American people in 2016, a fight hard won. The Pamunkey people were harassed by detractors who claimed that real indigenous people did not exist. In an argument that echoed centuries of attempts to deny the sovereignty of Pamunkey people and many other indigenous American societies, naysayers complained that because Native American people were bred out of existence with African Americans, the petitioners could not claim to be real and complete Pamunkey people. The Pamunkey people faced resistance when they politically organized to assert themselves and gain respect for their true, unique identity. And while intimacy and unions between Black Americans and indigenous people have existed for centuries, supporters of the status quo interpreted the legacy of these interracial marriages in a way that erased Native American identity, because they relied upon the myth that race is biological. In colonial Virginia, where the Pamunkeys thrived, the real history of racial identity for Black and indigenous Americans was more complex than bloodline, because it was unpredictable and subject to change over time. In the colonial era and 19th century, as it is now, white Virginians have envisioned racial identity as a binary between Black and white, and lumped the Pamunkey people in with Black and African Americans. In this lesson, I'll talk about the kinds of barriers faced by southeastern indigenous peoples, especially the Lumbees, Pamunkeys, and Cherokee peoples in finding respect from neighboring citizens and the federal government, as well as the political activism that these groups generated, and their attempts to create distinctively indigenous identities that provided them with legal standing and protection. This lesson draws from the work of the 3 monographs listed here. Karen Blue's book is a deep dive into the Lumbee people, their worldviews, and how their identity shifted in response to outside forces. The Lumbee are indigenous people who live in Robeson County, North Carolina. While the book was published some 40 years ago, and, according to Blue, most anthropological resource about the South was quantitative, it didn't capture the feelings and hopes of people who lived there. And so what that's meant is that any treatment of racial identity and cultural cross-pollination was bound to find the South to be a rigid, ossified, hierarchical place with little diversity and transfer. Blue makes a couple of major contributions to the historiography of Southern racial politics. Drawing on her fieldwork, the first advancement is how she shows the caste system of the South to be more flexible than previously thought. And within that environment, she shows how the Lumbee took a position that was neither Black nor white. As I'll talk about later, the Lumbee people came to see themselves not so much as an indigenous race, but as an ethnicity, that they formed around their identity a shared history, even up and against pressures to blend into white society. Secondly, and relatedly, whereas previous historians argued that the Lumbee had the political and legal status of free people of color, Blue complicates that picture when she argues that free Black Southerners and Lumbee were perceived as separate identity groups, and that race in Robeson County had 3 categories: Black, white, and Indian. Overall, this book traces the trajectory of Lumbee people into political prominence and highlights the ways in which they accomplished this. It is against the backdrop of the threat to absorb indigenous people into the social stigma surrounding Blackness that the second book, by Laura Feller, argues that despite any attempts of white officials to make Native identities dependent upon heredity and to racialize them in ways that would make them legally and socially inferior, the reality was that a distinct Pamunkey people survived, defined as it came to be by shared cultural features. The major case study in the mutability of racial identity presented by the book is the family of Lucy Perriman and William Scott. Feller leverages the historical record of this kinship network to show that Pamunkey people had to make strategic decisions about whether to sustain their indigenous identity by living with or close to one another, or play into the dogmatism of the black-white divide, especially in light of Virginia's 1924 Act to preserve racial integrity. One of the common themes throughout the books that I explore here to shed light on the issue of Indigenous recognition now is that, despite how they shared struggle against the white colonial system, when Native American people succeeded in carving out an identity for themselves, that was often because they endorsed segregation and the denigration of black people. As Feller shows, from the postbellum era through 1924, the Pamunkey people internalized racist beliefs and strove to separate themselves from African Americans, which usefully problematizes the distinction between victim and perpetrator that too often oversimplifies the realities of social injustices. Feller also shows how the Pamunkey people crystallized their Native American identity in pan-indigenous motifs and performances. Concomitantly, she argues, white academics undertook fieldwork that began to lend credibility to the idea that indigenous people were, quote, really Indian, at a time when blood and ancestry were the accepted determinants of race from the 1890s through the 1950s. When ethnographers studied indigenous people, the Pamunkey people could present themselves in ways that they suspect would make them more likely to be recognized as unique. For these reasons and more, the Pamunkey people were able to create unique institutions that set themselves apart from black Americans and emphasized their longevity and change. And yet, for all of the distance that Blue and Feller put between people of color and indigenous Americans, the third book, by Tia Miles, makes plain that they came together as well. The advantage of Miles's case study, The Shoeboots Family, is how it lends itself to the understanding that one cannot capture racial politics in the colonial Southeast without taking account of the intimate relationships between Cherokee peoples and African Americans. Shoeboots was a Cherokee warrior who married and took as his slave a black woman whose name was Doll in the 1790s, and later advocated for the liberation of his children, who had multiple racial identities. The relationship between Shoeboots and Doll upsets preconceptions that ordinary Americans might have about the colonial Southeast, especially with the facts that Cherokee men not only held black wives, but also slaves, and that Doll occupied both of these categories at the same time. If Shoeboots' families registers as anomalous to current understandings of Southeastern slave economies, it was simply unthinkable for contemporaries. It was certainly confounding for the Cherokee government, an institution that had criminalized unions between people of color and Cherokee people, but which allowed intermarriage between Cherokee people and white people. Miles's book is a close look into the slow descent of the Cherokee people into chattel slavery and anti-blackness, and it also traces the pockets of resistance that put the lie to the capitalist state that an invading Georgia sought to prop up. In covering the adoption of slavery by Cherokee people from white settler society and the growth of chattel slavery in the Southeast Cherokee Territory, and in the relocated Cherokee societies following the Trail of Tears, Miles argues that despite how the relationship between black Americans and the Cherokee had certainly deteriorated from prior to the Revolutionary War through the antebellum period in formal terms, in terms of the lived realities of black enslaved people, free black people, and Afro-Cherokee people, these were at once unique and porous positions. Along the way, Miles takes into account the impacts on Cherokee identity formation of missionary schools, settler ideas of land allocation and private property, the resistance of African Americans to Cherokee captivity. Central to Miles' monograph, as well as the others, is the question of how identity formation occurred in the South, and what agency historical actors came to play in creating race. What precedes is a survey of the barriers to the acceptance of indigenous identity at the levels of the state and the public, a brief assessment of how the Lumbee, Pamunkey, and Cherokee peoples viewed black and African Americans in light of the efforts of white legislatures to erase them. And then we finish with an analysis of the strategies that indigenous people adapted to assert their survival and flourishing. This historical context is necessary to understand not only the origins of the racial gatekeeping that continues to prevent federal recognition of Native American peoples today, but also the long-standing nature of the efforts of indigenous people to find belonging and pride in a nation taken from them. There are three main obstacles that Lumbees, Cherokees, and the Powhatan needed to overcome to be seen by others, especially white society, in the ways that they wanted and needed to be seen. The first, perhaps most obvious, is the level of fear and sensitivity surrounding racial identity and issues, especially during the Civil War era. This section delves into how ordinary Southerners interpreted racial hierarchies. As we find, the second barrier represents the consolidation of this prejudice into state-sanctioned eugenics legislation. Although white supremacists enforced these programs with frightening initiative and unilateral state power. The third barrier, often related to the second, goes through the intricacies of blood quantum ideology and how politicians purported to define race, although this section is also devoted to examples that show bloodline to be a fiction, based on an erroneous understanding of the past, along which racial identity could, ostensibly, be turned into an objective and scientific process and property. So desperate has white society been to imagine indigenous people as black people or mulatto, that the Lumbees, Cherokees, and Pamunkeys all took steps to remove themselves from black people. While many learned to hate the racial hierarchy that was hyper-fixated on the subjugation of slaves and later black citizens, they also distanced themselves from black people symbolically and in daily life, as a strategy to avoid the low status and lack of respectful treatment that black people endured. For fear of being seen as black, the Lumbees, Cherokees, and Pamunkey peoples usually adopted three major mechanisms for setting themselves apart. The first response was to create and sustain segregated schools and churches in which community culture could flourish uninterrupted, as if in an echo chamber. The second response was to form tightly knit extended family groups by way of associating with other people who were considered to be Indian in census data. By doing so, the racial flexibility of the southern edifice was manipulated, allowing many Pamunkey people even to be categorized as white. The third response was for these groups to adopt symbols and stereotypes through which white people could come to see them as indigenous people, particularly by way of donning regalia and by inserting themselves into white settler narratives. With regards to the Lumbee, they were lumped in as free persons of color since the 1790s. So when they lost their right to vote, bear arms without a license, and serve in the militia due to the, quote, Free Negro Code in 1856, petitions to make gun measures stricter and limit ownership of dogs to one for people of color circulated among white Robesonians. That measure struck some division between Lumbee people and white people, causing their tensions to go up and their relations to sour, leading some Lumbee people into slavery and to be stripped of any possibility of citizenship. These measures were a direct reflection of the fear of white citizens of Lumbee people. The outcome of the Civil War made white supremacists in the South feel threatened and worried that the Union would transfer their power to black people, so they had controversial feelings about the Lumbee, who were considered by white people to be, quote, mulattoes. Because Lumbees had lost lands and were, quote, forced to work along with black slaves on Confederate fortifications, they felt like they were being treated like black people. At this time, to be an indigenous person was to be considered a person of color. When he was asked by the state government to define mulattoes, Giles Leitch, a white lawyer, identified them as a cross between Spanish, Portuguese, and, quote, Indians, and identified by their hair, which becomes less, quote, straight and black, and more curly and kinky, and then real woolen. Even when pressed on how mulatto usually is a label that refers to people of multiple white and, quote, Negro races, Leitch capitulated that the label mulatto does refer to an intermediary category between white and black people, but that he, quote, did not know exactly how to describe those people, he's referring to indigenous people here, but knew enough to testify that indigenous people were, quote, thriftless, lazy, thievish, and indolent. Interestingly, in the Civil War era, where Native Americans were considered, quote, free persons of color, white people then ascribed to them the same kind of moral failings that white people attributed to black people in the 60s, including indolent, roguish, improvident, and dissipated, in a letter from Robesonians who tried to prevent people of color from getting alcohol, showing some kind of evolution in racial attitudes, or perhaps consistency in them. In order to subdue non-white people more effectively, the white legal system identified oppressed people in similar ways. Of course, it was easier for white people to identify Lumbee people in theory than in practice, for while the ancestors of the Lumbees were variously described as, quote, mulattoes or free Negroes in census data, other families seen as shifting between free white and free colored in census data show that race was actually a mutable category during this time, and that there was a great deal of differing skin colors among the ancestors of the Lumbee. In Virginia, as it was in North Carolina, race was defined so as to eliminate the indigenous people who were in plain sight. During the antebellum period, blood quantum was supposed to be the major determinant of race, but even in legal proceedings where heritage information was lacking, physical appearance ostensibly gave away one's racial identity. Bloodline was the measuring stick of racial identity in Virginia ever since a 1691 Virginia statute, which marked a transformation from referring to colonists as Englishmen to labeling them as white, helped that law prevent white people from marrying black people, quote, mulattoes, and indigenous people. Racial identity is not only invented, but encoded in bloodline years later in the law. For instance, the 1705 law in Virginia defined, quote, mulatto as anyone who had ancestors Native Americans and Africans. And when a 1723 law said that all non-white women had to pay taxes and took pains to specify that the law was referring to black, mulatto, and indigenous people, on the assumption that because the Gingaskins had intermarried with black people, when local government officials made sure their reservation was cut up and they divvied it up between white settlers, and they did this without any sort of troubling of conscience because they were able to reassure themselves that they had not dispossessed any Native Americans at all, but had instead removed troublesome and criminal, quote, free people of color, effectively destroying the Gingaskin property and name of the people. The same argument motivated a petition to dismantle the Pamunkey Reservation. And so for all of these reasons, the lead up to the Civil War and afterwards was fraught for Native people.